And for the last video of part 1 of this tutorial series, let's look at all the ways you can bounce and export your music. Now, even though it sounds pretty basic, I do see a lot of users not taking full advantage of some of these options. Before we continue, if you're watching this coming from another DAW, you may know these functions under a different term. Now, different DAWs can have different names for the exact same thing, so don't get confused, this is just how they named things for Logic. Now let's start with the difference between bouncing and exporting. Both exporting and bouncing do the same thing. They create an audio file of your project that you can share or upload. The main difference is that by exporting, we refer to the individual tracks, and by bouncing, we either refer to more than one track being bounced or actually bouncing the entire project. Well, you can still bounce just one track, but it will all make more sense as I demonstrate the functions. A bit of history time now, so feel free to skip this section. The term bouncing comes from the analog days of using tape to record. When you're recording on tape, there is a limit on how many tracks you can record. You could have 2 tracks, 4 tracks, whatever, and that was it. For example, the first 4-track recording of the Beatles was the I Want to Hold Your Hand. All of that music was made with these limitations. And one way of pushing past these limitations was the bounce down technique. So essentially, you bounce tracks together into one track and then you free up some tracks for the new material to be recorded. So let's start with bounce. We have 2 types of bouncing. You can either bounce within Logic with bounce in place, and that will create an audio file that will be part of your project, or you can bounce the project or region to create an audio file to use outside of Logic. Now the obvious beginner question would be, why would I want to bounce something inside my project? Bouncing is an extremely helpful tool for 2 reasons. First of all, you can create an audio track from your MIDI files, and I do that quite often. Once I'm happy with what I've got, and I got to the point where I know I'm not going to change it much, I create an audio track of my MIDI because it's so much easier to work with. And second, a very important reason is that it can really save up some CPU power. Now I know we've looked at the freezing options, but this one is also something that can help you with that. Now you may have a channel that has 15 plugins on it, for example. That's also the limit of how many plugins you can load in a single channel in Logic. You can create a bounce down version of that, and that will have all the processing from the plugins without the plugins on it. And then you can deactivate the track and the plugins and simply use the new one. So that way you can save a lot of processing power. Or you can do that for plugins that you know you're not going to change as the project progresses. So something like, let's say, a pitch correction plugin. Now let's start with bounce in place. And before we move on, I need to mention that the new file that will be created will follow the recording settings you have for the project. So Command and comma to bring up the settings, and then go to recording. I have it on wave, and if you want your bounces to be at a different format, you can change it here. Now the first thing you need to do is to select the track or tracks that you want to bounce in place. So let's say that I want to bounce this region here. I select it first, and then important shortcut, Ctrl and B, B as in bounce. Or if you prefer the long way, you can go all the way up here to File and then go to Bounce and select one of these options. Actually, another way of doing it is just by right-clicking on the region of the track. So I will simply right-click and then select Bounce in Place. This will bring up this window here. The first option is the name field. You can either give it a name or use the name Logic comes up with, which is the name of the default region with the extension BIP at the end, which means bounced in place. The second option, destination, allows you to choose where you want the new track to be created. If the option selected track is not available, as it is not right now, that means that you are trying to bounce a region while you have a software instrument selected. So since this is going to be an audio track, you can't bounce it down into an audio track. So if I cancel that and select this one and press Ctrl B, you will see that the selected track option is now available. Now if we select the new track, it will create a new track underneath the original one. I have actually put some automation on it, so whenever we bounce that channel, you can actually see the effect of it. So new track will create a track underneath that. Let's try that. Let's Command Z and let's go back. And the selected track will replace the original one with the new bounce. So let's try that as well. And the original one is now gone. So let's Command Z, Control B. And I have to say that I never use the selected track option because I always want to keep a copy of the original. Now the next options are the source buttons. These will determine what will happen to the default region. So you can either leave it exactly as it is, or you can mute it, which is quite helpful when you're working with software instruments, or you can delete it. Mind you, if you select delete, it will not delete the track, only the region. Include instrument multi-outputs. That can be selected for instruments that have multi-outputs and you want to include those aux channel strips as well. I will look more of that in future videos. Bypass effect plugins. That will bypass all the plugin effects that you have loaded on the track. So if you want an unprocessed version before you bounce it, you don't need to disable the plugins one by one. You can simply just select that one. Bounce second loop pass is exactly like the bounce second cycle pass, and we will look at that in a bit. Include audio tail in file will continue the bounce process even after the end of the region. It will continue until there is no more signal. Sometimes you may add a bit of reverb, and that will obviously add some more space on the region, and that will add some signal even after the region end. So if you want to include that, you need to tick this box. Include audio tail in region is the same, but instead of adding it to the file, it adds it on the region. So these are essentially the same. So let me demonstrate. Let's bounce the audio with the tail in file. Let's do it like that. Let's not delete, let's just leave it as it is. And new track, so I'm going to press OK. As you can see, the new region is exactly the same length as the original region. But the new information is written on it, so I can simply just grab the end and extend it. Okay, let's Command Z. And now let's try the other option, include audio tail in region. I'm going to press OK. Now, as you can see, it is already bounced in the new length. I do not have to grab it and extend it. It's already written on it. And let's Command Z and let's Control B again. Now the last option asks you if you want to include the volume and panning automation that you might have. The next one, normalize, will give you three options. You can either turn normalize off, in which case it will bounce down the file, the region exactly as it is. You can have it on, which will do bidirectional normalization, and it will bring your region to the loudest possible level without clipping. And the middle option, overload protection only. That will only apply normalization in case your levels go above 0 dB. So in order to prevent clipping. The levels below that will not be normalized. This is only for protection of clipping. And in case you want to go back to the default settings, let's say you have whatever you have here, you can simply click on Restore Defaults, and that will take you back to the default settings. Also, the bounce in place function will ignore your cycle. So for example, let's say I've got this cycle here. I'm going to press Command B, I'm going to press OK. And as you can see, it completely ignores it. And of course, if you want multiple tracks, you can either click on the tracks you want by dragging and making a selection. So just like that. And I can press Command B. And now both of these will be bounced in place. Or you can hold Shift and then select the ones that you want. And these can also be tracks that are not under each other in the timeline. For example, let's do this one. And let's do this one. And let's Control B. And there you go. Now it creates a track for both of these. Let's Command Z. Now before we move on to the next option, I need to mention that there is one more way of bouncing in place, and that is through the Edit menu. Now you can select the regions that you want to bounce. So let's say I want this one. and this one. And then you can go up here to edit, and then bounce and join, and then bounce regions in place. That will bring up the previous window with the same options. Now the next option is to bounce the whole track in place. The difference is that this option will bounce the whole track from the beginning of the project to the end. As before, you can access it the same way, but we are going to use the shortcut. So let's say we want to bounce this channel. So Control, Command and B as in bounce, and that will bring up the bounce track in place window. Now as you can see, we have less options than before, but the ones that we have are exactly the same as the options on the bounce region window. The way this will work is that it will start from the very beginning of the project and it will continue until the very last region of the track. So I'm going to press OK. It has of course scanned the entire project, but since the origin ends here, the last region, it will only go to here from the beginning. And of course, you can do that for multiple tracks. As before, you select the tracks that you want and then simply bounce those. So let's say we want this one and this one. That will create a new track under each selected track. So let's do that, press OK. And now I've got the new track underneath the original one. So let's Command Z. Let's actually make the project smaller. Let's bring it here. Now the very last bounce option is the bounce project or section. Now as before, you can access it through the menu or important shortcut Command and B as in bounce, but there is an additional method of accessing that option. You can actually open the mixer and then go to the stereo out right here and then simply click on this button here, the BNC, which stands for bounce, and that will also bring this window up. So Command B, and we now have the bounce project or section window. Now this is used to bounce a project and create a file that can be used outside of Logic. So if you want an MP3 or a WAV file, this is the window that you want. So let's take it from the top. Let's start with the destination window. Here you get your different audio type options. If you click on each one of them, it gives you different settings on the right side for each one. So the first one, PCM, which stands for Pulse Code Modulation, is for your uncompressed types of audio. So if you want a high quality uncompressed file, you tick this box here. Just like that. And on the right, you can choose what type of file you want on the file format. In Logic, you can bounce to AAF, which is Apple's version of the WAV file, the classic WAV file, and CAF. And if you're a bit confused about these, I cover them in more detail on video 20 of this series, Basic Audio Recording and Preferences. I will leave it on WAV because that is the one I always use. Underneath that, we can select our resolution. Again, if you want to know more about bit depth and the next option, which is the sample rate, I cover it in great detail on video 18 of the series, sample rate, bit depth and buffer size. Now next we get the file type. You have either split or interleaved. By default, it will be on interleaved. That means that the bounce will create a single stereo file with both the left and the right channel on it. Now the split option will create two audio files, one for the right channel and one for the left. And the last option is dithering. Dithering is when you add low-level noise to an audio file. Now that sounds like it's a bad thing, but it's actually an important tool for maintaining a good quality audio file when you want to bounce down to a lower bit depth. For example, I am at 24 bits right now. If I want to create a file for a CD, I will have to go down to 16 bits. So that's 8 bits less. If I don't use dithering, that may actually cause some distortion. So I use this function here when I want to bounce down to a lower bit depth. Now you get various options here, but I'll be honest with you, the few times that I had to use it, I couldn't tell much of a difference between them. And then the surround bounce will be an option if you have a surround project. We will look at all of that at part 2 of the series. The last two options allow you to either add your file to the project, which will create a new track at the very bottom with the whole project bounced down. And the last option will add it to Apple Music, the software that plays back audio files on your Mac. Now the next type is the MP3, which I'm sure you're aware that is not a lossless file. It will have a loss of audio quality. So let's look at the settings for this one. Here we have an option for mono and stereo file bitrate. It's actually nice that you have an option for both. When I am working on voiceovers or audiobooks and they ask me for a sample, I always give them a mono file. And you can choose the bitrate option for both here. Essentially, you're choosing the quality and compression of the file. So the higher the bitrate, the better the quality, but the larger the size. Now these options are for the CBR, which stands for constant bitrate, meaning that the bitrate will be the same for the MP3. If you want, you can use a different encoding method by clicking on this one, use variable bitrate encoding, VBR. So this technically has a better audio quality in comparison to file size ratio, and the bitrate keeps changing during the encoding process. The reason that by default this one is not selected, this is not activated, is because some media players can't accurately decode those files, but the CBR process will work 100% of the time. The next one, quality, self-explanatory. Unless you're sending a low quality demo on purpose, you should always keep that on highest. Use best encoding, same principles as the quality. Tick it if you want the best results, and filter frequencies below 10 Hz will cut out everything below 10 Hz. So these are frequencies that are outside our hearing rates but still add energy and size to the file. So by checking this box, you are cutting out those frequencies. Next, stereo mode gives you two options, normal and joint stereo. So 99% of the time, you won't hear a difference between these two. So technically, depending on the project, you may get some audible difference. And you need to test both to see if that is actually the case with your project. The next one is write ID3 tags. Here we can add information to the file. So if I click on the ID3 settings, we get this window here. Here we can add all the information we want for the file. And when you have that file on your computer and right click on it, and then you go to details, everything you write here will be available for that. So let's cancel that, and the very last option, like before, is the add to music. Now the next option will produce an MP4 file. So let's look at the options here. Now you can either select between the Advanced Audio Codec, AAC, or between the Apple Lossless to decode your MP4 file. Now the difference between these two is that the AAC will compress it more heavily, and that will result in a smaller size. It's still a high quality file though. There are a few things that we need to mention if you want to bounce your project into an MP4 file though. So if you select this option, you can't have the surround option ticked. Also, an MP4 file does not support a sample rate that is higher than 48 kHz. So if you try to bounce it and you're above 48 kHz, a window will pop up asking you if you want Logic to convert it down to 48 kHz. For AAC, we do get an option to select or bitrate, but for Apple Lossless, select that. That option is no longer available. As with the MP3, we can encode with VBR, but as I have already explained, some media players will not be able to play back the files. And as before, we can also add it to music. And the very last option, and that will probably apply to the extreme minority of people watching this video, is actually something that you can use to burn your music directly to a CD or a DVD. As you can see, I do not have one connected, but if I did and I want to burn that straight into a CD, I would need to click this option. And now for the other options that are exactly the same, no matter which type we choose. As you can see, these options just stay the same. So far, all the bounce options we have looked at completely ignored the cycle range. This one, though, doesn't. It will only bounce what is within the cycle range, and if nothing is selected, then it will bounce down the whole project until the very end. And by the very end, I mean, let me close that, I don't mean until the last region, but the very end of the project. So if I zoom out, it will go all the way here. And you can either click and drag to change that, or if you bring up the customize control and then you choose, I think, key signature and project end, then you can also change it from here. There you go, just like that. In any case, let's go back, Command B. So the start and end options will either be the cycle range or the whole project. And you can, of course, change it by either clicking and dragging, just like that, or, simply by just typing it in. I never do that. I always use the cycle range as it is much easier. For example, let's do that and press Command B, and now you see that it is following the cycle range. Now, underneath that, we get the option of real time and offline. Now, in real time, the project will play back from the beginning to the end, or at least the selected portion for the bounce, and it will bounce it down in real time. And the offline will bounce it down straight away. I know that people argue that real-time bounces are better, but in my opinion, and from my experience and from the research I have done on the topic, there is absolutely zero difference. The only reason that I have found that you may want to use the real-time bounce is if you have external MIDI hardware that are playing something and you want to record their output. And that will have to be done in real time. But even then, I would simply print the external MIDI hardware into an audio track to make it part of my project and then make my life easier. In any case, you can select the mode here. The next one, bounce a second cycle pass, is only available with the real-time mode. And what this does is that it takes 2 repetitions of the cycle range and the bounce starts at the second one. So technically, this was good in older systems when certain plugins would not produce the desired sound or effect on the first pass. The second pass will solve that problem, but that is not a problem nowadays. The only reason you might want to use it is if you want to include the effect tails from the end of your project and the first pass, and not that to the beginning of the bounced file. Let's go back and include audio tail. As with the regions, it will extend the file to include the added effect. And then include tempo information will include all the audio markings, points, curves and markers on the bounce down file. And then if you import such a file in Logic Pro, it will ask you if you want to import the tempo information as well. For normalize, we have the exact same options we have been through for the other bounce windows. And at the very end, it will give you some information on the size and length of the new file. And those are the 4 different bouncing options of Logic. Let's move on to exporting tracks. Now, as I said before, this is for individual tracks. With export, you can have one, more than one, or all of your tracks exported as audio files. And that includes everything: audio tracks, software tracks, and drummer tracks. And each one will produce one file. So one file per track. Now let's look at an example and let's use one of the export functions that you will be using the most. So let's say that I want to export this track here. Let's unmute it. So I want to create a file of this track outside of Logic. And I also want, let's say, to do just the first 3 regions. So if I use the bounce option, I will have to go set the range, solo the track, and then bounce it. But with export, I can simply select the track or tracks and just do it. So I select the regions that I want, let's say these 3, and then I go to File, and then I go to Export. And then I get a lot of options here. So let's explore the selection as audio file. Now you already know most of these. These options are the same as with the bounce options, but what I want us to look at is the naming options down here. If you are sharing your files with someone else and or even, if you're bouncing down files for yourself, exporting, a good naming system is important. Here you can click and drag certain components to create the file name. Some will also have a little arrow that you can click and expand a menu. Actually, let's try that. I can have the project name just once, year, month, and I can actually click here and select the format that I want. Let's say I want that one, month, just like that. And if you don't like the order, you can actually drag them and rearrange them. Just move them around. Go on, there you go. And if you don't like something, you can just simply grab it and hit delete on your keyboard. And then you can also create a custom name for it. What you need to do in order to do that is you need to drag the custom icon here, because if I type something here, it doesn't come up. But if I grab the custom, then put here, and then just write something, I don't know. And the text will be placed where you have placed the custom box. So if I move that here, that will also be moved here. And at the bottom, you can actually get the file name example of what you have created. So once you're happy with your options, then you can select where you want to save it and then hit export. Now that will create a file that is the length between the start of your first selected region and the end of your last selected region. So you might be wondering, what happens if I want to create a track, but I don't want to have certain regions that are between the regions that I want? So that's easy. Logic will completely ignore the regions that you have not selected. So let's look at an example. So let's say that I want this one and this one. So I'm not selecting these three right here. So as before, let's go to export, selection as audio file, and let's go to this file here. The name looks good, so I'm going to press export. Let's create a new audio track, and let's go to this file here. You are right here. So that's the created file, and let's put it right here. And as you can see, it completely ignored the regions that I have not selected. Now, what if you want the whole track as an audio file? So let's select that one and then go to File and then Export. And this time you need to select one track as audio file. Or, the shortcut for that is Command and E as in echo. And as you can see, this brings up the same window with the exact same options that you already know. The one track as audio file can be used for any track. It can be a MIDI or a drummer track. Also, if you want to make a selection of more than one tracks, that is also possible. So let's select a couple. So this one, and then go up here to export. Now it will say 2 tracks as audio files, and the name will change depending on how many you have selected. And then here you can export as many tracks as you want simply by selecting them. Now, if you want to send your project to be mixed by someone else, then you need to send them the stems. So that means that you need to export each track individually. And the way you do that in Logic is by exporting all tracks. So once again, File, and then Export, and then we select all tracks as audio files. Now that will create an audio file for each track, and all of them will be the same length. Their length will start from the beginning of the project and will go to the end of the last region. Well, unless you have selected something different on the range option right here. Other than audio tracks, you can also export MIDI tracks. That is very helpful if you want to import MIDI information into other software. So you can either do one track, as we have here. So you go again to File, Export, and then go to Selection as MIDI file. Or you could have all your MIDI tracks be exported as MIDI files by selecting all MIDI tracks as MIDI files. And you don't get any options for this, it's just a MIDI file, so it'll just simply ask you where you want to save it. Also, there are a few other options, let's have a look at them. So the first one, Region Cell to Loop Library. Essentially, this is how you create your own loops that will be added on the loop browser. On the window that pops up, you can put in the details of the loop in order to make it easy to find it if you're searching for it. Now, more of that at a future video. And let's go back. Now the next one, let's actually select something. The next one, regions as audio files, will create a file for each one of the selected regions. So one file per region. So since we have 9 regions, it will say 9 regions as audio files. The next one underneath that, audio files as, will export the audio file that is in the region as an audio file. So if I use any of the other options we have looked at so far, they will export the file exactly as it is right now. But if you look, these regions here, they are shortened. So if I select all of them and then go to export audio files as, it will create a file of all the audio that is contained in the region. So I know that these files have been created using 4 regions that I have shortened. So if I export this, then I will get the 4 original regions with their original length. So let's actually do that. Let's go to test and let's go export and let's have a look. And as you can see, I now get the 4 original regions that I have shortened here. And lastly, let's go back to export. We get a few more options, a few more advanced options. So the first option is project as AAF. AAF stands for Advanced Authoring Format. Now these files can contain multimedia information such as metadata and video. Another DAW you can import these is Pro Tools. Next, you can export a Final Cut Pro XML file that can be used to export and import audio data between Logic and Final Cut, which is Apple's video editing software. Now these files will include certain track automation, such as volume and panning, and that is quite useful if you're working with moving image. The next two have to do with surround sound. They are obviously not available right now as my project is not a Dolby Atmos project. So if you're working on a Dolby Atmos mix and you want to export that project, then you can bounce it down to the ADM BWF files. Now this stands for Audio Definition Model Broadcast Wave Format. If you're ever going to give a Dolby Atmos project to a mastering engineer or to mixing engineer, then this is the file format that you need to hand them. More about Dolby Atmos in Logic at a future video. And the last option, Score as Music XML, is when you have MIDI software instruments and you want to export their sheet music. And you can then import that file into a notation software such as Sibelius or MuseScore. And that is actually everything you need to know about exporting and bouncing. Until the next one.